The meeting of the subcommittee is called to order, and today we are meeting to review the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009 discussion draft. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement initially. This discussion draft was released by Chairman Waxman, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, Chairman Stupak, Representative DeGette, Representative Sutton, and myself early last week, and the draft bills on several bills already introduced in this Congress, including H.R. 759, a bill that I, along with Chairman Dingell and Stupak, introduced earlier this year. The Energy and Commerce Committee has done a lot of work on the issue of food safety. In this subcommittee alone, we have had 4 hearings on this topic in the last 2 years. The information we learned during these hearings, as well as during the numerous conversations we've had with stakeholder groups in the FDA, has been incorporated into the draft before us today. And I believe this draft bill represents a strong, well-thought-out approach to improving the FDA and its food safety activities. We've heard time and again that our current food safety system is broken. It's a system that relies heavily on the FDA rather than placing the responsibility on the manufacturers to ensure the safety of their products. It's a system that is geared towards responding to food outbreaks rather than one that is aimed at preventing them. And this system does not work, and recent outbreaks of E. coli in spinach and salmonella in peppers and peanut butter highlight that fact. Unfortunately, these are not isolated instances. Each year, 76 million Americans get sick due to unsafe food products. Every year, 325,000 individuals will be hospitalized, and 5,000 will die from foodborne hazards. It's estimated that the medical costs and lost productivity due to foodborne diseases cost us $44 billion annually, and these illnesses are completely preventable. The good news is that there seems to be agreement that something must be done and that it must be done quickly. The President has made food safety one of his priorities. He's assembled a food safety working group to come up with principles on this issue. Chairman Waxman, Dingell, Mr. Stupak, and I have worked closely with key stakeholders on this discussion draft, and as we move forward with the legislation, we hope to continue those conversations as well as conversations with our counterparts on this committee. The bill we're discussing today will modernize the food safety laws currently in place. It places a strong emphasis on prevention and shifts the responsibility for food safety onto those who actually make the food. It also provides the FDA with the necessary resources and enforcement authorities to ensure that all companies are in compliance with the new requirements. This draft bill would require all food manufacturing companies to register annually with the FDA so that the agency has an up-to-date list of all facilities who sell products in the United States. It focuses on prevention by requiring companies to conduct thorough hazard and risk analysis of the products that they're making. It mandates that companies put in place preventive controls to mitigate and minimize those identified hazards, and it requires companies to document all the steps they've taken to implement and verify the controls to ensure they're effectively minimizing hazards. The bill also addresses the shortfalls of our current traceback system by requiring the FDA to establish an electronic interoperable record-keeping system that manufacturers would be required to use. This measure will allow the agency to quickly trace the source of an outbreak back to its origin and prevent and minimize the number of individuals affected by a foodborne illness. While shifting responsibility for food safety onto the manufacturers, the draft also recognizes the crucial role the FDA needs to play in this realm. This draft requires the agency to set standards for food safety and hold the food industry accountable for meeting those standards. It provides the FDA with stronger enforcement authorities, such as recall authority and access to records. The bill also increases the inspection frequency for food facilities, requiring that the FDA inspect facilities at an established minimum frequency. Now, we're going to hear today from industry experts about the various provisions in this discussion draft, and I look forward to those conversations. I hope that we can all continue to work in this collaborative manner as we move to markup of food safety legislation in this committee. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Margaret Hamburg of the FDA today. We had a meeting last week while we were doing the energy markup. We were in the back having some conversations, and I was very impressed with her. This is the first time she'll be testifying before this committee, and I thank her for being here. I also want to thank our other witnesses for appearing before us today. I especially want to welcome back Mike Ambrosio. He's, of course, from my home state. Good to see you again, Mike. And I'll now recognize Mr. Deal for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, and for holding this hearing today, and thanks to our distinguished witnesses who have joined us to review this draft of the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. I look forward to your testimony and to the questions that this panel, that our committee will actually have of the panels. As a resident of the state of Georgia, which has already received a focal point focus of the issue of food safety, I know firsthand the perspective that our nation has on the issue of the lack of safeguards and fallback measures that many people expect of a 21st century food supply chain in our country. We all agree food safety is a priority, and I support giving FDA the resources it needs to ensure our nation's food supply remains safe and reliable for American dinner tables across the country. Additionally, implementation of preventive controls such as hazard analysis and critical point plan included in the draft under discussion is an important step forward in ensuring unsafe food products don't reach store shelves in the first place. As we know, preventing compromised goods from entering the market is the best line of defense to preventing food-related illnesses. I also believe it's important to enhance FDA's ability to conduct on-site inspections of food facilities. The inspection schedule established under the draft does recognize risk profiles for food in terms of how frequently facilities should be inspected. But the regimen set forth in the discussion draft fails to address the cost-benefit factor of conducting such frequent inspections and could possibly result in insufficient oversight of certain higher-risk facilities due to time and manpower limitations of our inspectors. It is my hope that our witnesses here today can provide input with regard to an appropriate inspection schedule which achieves the goal of ensuring safe food for the American people without placing an undue burden and strain on the FDA, which is already challenged under current food safety obligations. This legislation authorizes an annual pay-to-play registration fee for domestic and foreign food facilities of $1,000 to supplement appropriations made by Congress to FDA. In discussion, however, we've not been able to determine from the majority or the FDA exactly how much funding is necessary to meet the requirements of this bill. I believe it would be premature to impose significant fees on industry and in turn the American consumers without any reference as to how much funding is actually needed. If the majority remains intent on imposing such registration fees, we must also be certain these fees are limited to cover the activities which are such as a minimal fee paid to the FDA for an application to cover the cost of review and processing. If the goal is to improve food safety, we must ensure that funds are not funneled into other activities that may or may not have anything to do with improving food safety, a situation which I believe could occur under the language of the current proposal. Obviously, these are issues, among many others, that I feel hopefully this committee will be able to address as we move this issue forward. And I look forward to the hearing today and the results that come out of it. I appreciate Chairman Pallone and Chairman Waxman's bipartisan efforts on this issue and look forward to having a product that all the members of this committee can support. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Mr. Waxman, Chairman Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This subcommittee and our full committee is beginning the process today of passing critically important legislation designed to revamp our nation's food safety system, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009, and this hearing marks a key milestone. Over the past few years, a series of foodborne disease outbreaks in spinach, peanuts, and peppers, just to name a few, have laid bare some major gaps in our antiquated food safety laws. Oversight work by GAO and by our own oversight committee has also helped us understand where we need to focus our efforts to bring our food safety laws into the 21st century. The draft legislation that is the subject of today's hearing is based on the FDA Globalization Act of 2009, introduced by Chairman Emeritus Dingell, Chairman Pallone, and Chairman Stupak, and I commend them for their work on that bill and their continued efforts in shaping this new bill. I also want to recognize the assistance we've received from the Obama administration. We worked closely with the FDA to identify problems with the current food safety law and to find workable solutions. We will not be passing legislation that sets up the agency to fail. The bill requires that the agency set tough standards, but we've given them the flexibility to prioritize and address the most important risks first. The draft also incorporates helpful suggestions from Ranking Members Barton and Deal and Representative Shimkus. I believe we can reach a bipartisan agreement and look forward to continuing to work with all the members of this committee. In working with the FDA on this legislation, one thing was abundantly clear. The administration is absolutely committed to overhauling FDA's food safety program. I think we'll all see that commitment today when we hear from Commissioner Hamburg. The recent food outbreaks have exposed glaring holes in FDA's basic food safety authorities. FDA does not have routine access to any records kept by the food manufacturers. FDA cannot require companies to conduct a recall of unsafe foods. The agency can only ask and hope that the company complies. FDA also lacks basic modern enforcement tools like administrative civil monetary penalties. The Food Safety Enhancement Act will give FDA these and other critical authorities. One of the most important changes that will occur under this bill is a focus on prevention. The legislation does not anticipate that FDA alone will protect us from unsafe food. The hallmark of any effective food safety law must be a shared responsibility for food safety oversight between FDA and industry. The Act will strike the right balance in this shared responsibility. The bill will require manufacturers to implement preventive systems to stop outbreaks before they occur and will give FDA the tools it needs to hold them accountable if they fail. Under the bill, FDA will also have clear authority to issue and require manufacturers to meet strong, enforceable performance standards to ensure the safety of various types of food. I commend many of those in industry for recognizing the importance of this prevention model and coming to the table to support it. Let me turn briefly to one of the more contentious issues in the bill, the registration fees. I wish we did not have to resort to industry fees to supplement funding for FDA's work. However, when it comes to FDA's food program, the shortfall in revenues is extreme. The FDA's own science board told us that the FDA is so starved for resources that American lives are at risk. We cannot realistically expect appropriations alone to provide sufficient resources to close that gap. The recent outbreaks have also taken a major toll on the food industry. In the recent peanut outbreak, Kellogg's alone lost $70 million. Faced with such a dire situation, I think it's reasonable to ask the food industry to chip in. A robust food safety oversight system will provide a great benefit to industry by preventing future outbreaks and rebuilding consumer confidence. Let me be clear, we are not asking industry to cover the entire cost of the bill or any single part of the bill, like the cost of inspections. The bill establishes a set fee of $1,000 per year per facility. FDA is prohibited from increasing that fee in future years except to cover the cost of inflation. The bill simply asks industry to chip in its fair share. I also want to address another concern I've heard, the presence of FDA on farms. FDA has always had the authority of foods on farms, and they've generally relied on state and local authorities for food safety oversight on farms because they have a strong on-farm presence. I'm confident that farmers have nothing to fear from this bill. The bill calls for FDA to set its standards through regulation, which means the FDA will go through a public notice and comment process. Our committee is busy in the middle of this three-month period. Last month we passed a comprehensive energy and climate change legislation. Soon we'll take up health care reform. But food safety is so critical that I've carved out time right in between to pass this legislation. Over the next few weeks, I intend to work with all our committee members, Democratic and Republican, with the FDA, with the affected industries, to achieve a consensus on a food safety bill that we can pass out of committee. We can't afford to wait any longer. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate your having this hearing on this very important issue today. We all recognize that FDA has many very important responsibilities, and we've known through hearings for the last number of years that the resources available are always in question. But we recognize also that there's a definite need for reform of FDA, and we're delighted that Dr. Hamburg is here with us today to provide testimony, and the other panel of witnesses as well. We look forward to working with the majority on this important legislation. And having said that, we do have some significant concerns about some provisions in this legislation, particularly the risk-based inspection portion, particularly that relating to the low-risk facilities. Also, the traceability provisions that I understand, for example, would apply to every convenience store in the country. In addition to that, the recall provisions in this legislation, the country of origin provisions, particularly as it relates to the website requirements, and then also, of course, the ability or the power that we give to FDA for subpoenas and other instruments to obtain company records. I think we need to look at those provisions much more closely. But obviously, this is an important piece of legislation. We look forward to working with you and listening to the testimony of our witnesses today. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is our Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, and thank you for all you've done on this legislation.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for holding today's legislative hearing on the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009 discussion draft. We've worked together, you and I, with Chairman Stupak and others over the years, and I'm delighted to say that this legislation is ready for enactment and is almost old enough to vote. I want to say that I'm delighted that Chairman Waxman and my good colleagues, Ms. DeGette and Mr. Sutton and Ms. Sutton have joined us in our work on this bill. We're about to try and fund an agency which is hollow, which does not have either the personnel or the revenue or the money or the resources which it needs to do its job. And we're about, for the first time since 1962, when I was a young member of this body, to try and see to it that it gets its authorities updated to deal with the real problems in the world of trade and in the world marketplace. I'm pleased that we're taking the necessary steps to advance this legislation and address the important issue of food safety. I'm hopeful that we will shortly be doing something with regard to pharmaceuticals. I want to thank the witnesses who've joined us today and look forward to hearing their testimony. And Dr. Hamburg, welcome to the committee. Congratulations on your confirmation. I was encouraged by the administration's early recognition that food safety is a problem that needs to be addressed. The administration Food Safety Working Group is a signal to how serious the President considers this issue. And I want to thank you for the way that you and your staff have provided timely and helpful technical advice on the legislation. I want to note that I'm hearing complaints from folks about the fee system. I want to make a note that the only part of Food and Drug that seems to be working is that which functions under PDUFA and which has the advantage of having industry participating in the funding. I want to note that the industry seems to be prospering mightily under that particular section and be getting service from Food and Drug in a proper way, and that seems to be about the only place that the industry is getting protection or the American consumers are receiving necessary safety. In 1938, the Congress comprehensively addressed the issue of food safety. 70 years later, Food and Drug Administration is still trying to protect a larger, increasingly global supply with outdated statutes and inadequate resources. As a result, the American consumer confidence in the nation's food supply, in the Food and Drug Administration, and quite frankly, in this body, the Congress, has declined. And American consumers are being forced to pay a heavy price, not only with recall after recall, but also the fact that people are being sickened and killed by unsafe foods and also by pharmaceuticals. And again, I wish to hope that we will commence work on pharmaceuticals as soon as this business is attended to. The Food Safety Enhancement Act is a measured and effective response to the dire situation we are faced with today regarding food safety. Mr. Chairman, the legislation is based on a bill you, Chairman Stupak, and I have introduced earlier this year, and also on a bill that was introduced by me during the past Congress. It includes good technical advice from FDA and valued input from the minority and other stakeholders. And I want to make clear that I am working with the minority to try and resolve their concerns, and that we're also working with the industry. And I want to thank my friends in the industry for the goodwill which they have shown in working with us. And I also want to thank Chairman Waxman for his leadership on this point. I look forward to continued deliberations in the hope of producing speedily a bipartisan piece of legislation that will pass the committee and the House, as I've indicated, both in a correct and a speedy fashion. Amongst other things, this bill will prevent safety problems before they occur. It will require manufacturers to implement food safety plans that identify and protect against food hazards. It will see that Food and Drug has the authority to see to it that good manufacturing practices are adhered to here in the United States and elsewhere, especially in places like China, which is in fact the Wild West in this particular matter. It will advance the science of food safety, increase inspection frequency of food facilities, something which can happen more often on dog food manufacturers under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture than it happens with regard to manufacturers who manufacture food products for the safety of our people. It will enhance FDA's ability to trace the origin of tainted food in the event of an outbreak or food-borne illness. And it should be noted that the Food and Drug Administration and the industry are totally incapable of providing speedy service in this particular. It will enhance the safety of imported food. FDA will be allowed to require that certain foods be certified as meeting U.S. safety standards, and again, to trace. But also, Food and Drug will be able to finally get enough people at the doors of this country to see to it that safety is properly enforced and that good manufacturing practices are adhered to around the world for the protection of our people. It will provide strong enforcement tools, including mandatory food recall authority, stronger criminal and civil penalties for bad actors, subpoena authority, and it will increase and strengthen Food and Drugs detention authority. Finally, and I would argue more importantly, the legislation addresses the very important question of resources of the agency. We will give the agency the authorities it needs, and we would do them a grave disservice if we did not give them the resources they need. The legislation includes a registration fee, which will fund food safety activities at FDA. The revenue from this fee, coupled with additional appropriations, which we hope we can get out of those skinflints at the Appropriations Committee and the Office of Management and Budget, will ensure that Food and Drug can do its job. For those who argue there's no benefit for the industry to pay a fee for safety activities at Food and Drug, I offer the following. U.S. peanut industry could lose $1 billion this year because of the outbreak of salmonella that forced the biggest food recall in history. That has just been replicated by other recalls in the food industry. Tomato industry lost $100 million in sales during the 2008 salmonella outbreak that ultimately was attributed to jalapeno peppers. Spinach growers took a $200 million hit to their industry during a 2006 bag spinach recall. And let us not forget that wonderful Chilean grape scare of 1989, which Food and Drug had neither the authority nor the competence to address. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. I have a few other things I'd like to say that I know everybody will want to read. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hamburg, welcome. I see Chairman Waxman's left the room. I appreciate his comments about there being some discussions. I do have to admit that the discussions that we've had, when we point out a point that is correct, they accept. When there is a debatable point, Mr. Chairman, there does not seem to be any movement and compromise. So I would encourage more discussions on some of these issues if we really want this to be a bipartisan bill. You know, the other thing I have trouble with is draft hearings. If we're going to have a legislative hearing, let's have the legislation. This is draft legislation, and if we had the great draft legislation hearing on climate change, and then when the bill came before us, it had 300 additional pages in it. And there's fear on our part that this is a sneaky way to say, yeah, we had a legislative hearing, but you really don't have a legislation hearing if you don't have the legislation before you. This is the Democratic majority operandi. We claim a crisis, only government can be the savior, government must get bigger, and the middle class pays. And that's the issue here. And I was on O&I in the last Congress with Bart Stupak, readily accepting the premise that we have to get inspectors into these facilities. And we're ready to address an issue that's thoughtful and respectful and pays for the inspectors in facilities where they're not going into. And it's not like we haven't done anything. Last Congress, approximately $57 million from the supplemental went to food safety. The House passed the 2009 omnibus, appropriated an additional $325 million for the FDA, with $140 million of the $325 million would go for food safety programs. In the President's 2010 budget, he included $1 billion additional dollars to FDA for food safety. So there is a huge commitment already for massive federal funds to go to food safety. Now we have, as our concern, a bill, a draft that has, $325 million for no explanation, no earmarking, no direction, and that's where a lot of our questions will be today, is why that amount, what justifies that amount, how are we going to ensure that it's not going to be used for other purposes, and the like. So I would ask the leadership on the other side that if they really want a bipartisan bill, let's get some bipartisan negotiations, sincere negotiations. I would be honored to yield.
I'm very fond of the gentleman, as he very well knows, and I have great respect for him, and I've been talking, as the gentleman well knows, to the leadership on the minority side, both in the last Congress and in this Congress. I want this legislation to be bipartisan. I don't want the gentleman to be surprised. I would note to my good friend that we have been having hearings after hearings after hearings, not only here, but up in the Oversight Subcommittee. And that during that time, I have been continually talking to my good friends on the minority side, because I want you to be aboard. This should not be a partisan issue. And when we go to the next step in this process, I will assure the gentleman that most of the changes that will be made will be changes that will be made as a result of discussions with my friends on the minority side.
And I thank the colleague, and I look forward to working with you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Next is the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is the first step towards realizing a long-held dream, not just by me and other members of this committee, but by the millions of Americans who have been concerned about the safety of our food, especially in light of the cascading litany of foodborne illnesses that we've heard about from other members of this committee. We've had a dozen oversight hearings and also legislative hearings. We've had bills dropped by many members of Congress for many years, and I'm so excited under your leadership and the leadership of Chairman Waxman and Chairman Dingell that we're finally on the verge of enacting comprehensive food safety legislation. The most important thing about this bill is it would be a definitive statement by this committee and this Congress that food safety is a priority in the United States of America. I want to highlight two of the sections of this bill, and I want to thank you and Mr. Dingell and others and Mr. Stupak for including the provisions of my two bills in this draft mark, because they're critically important in the future to assuring safe food for everybody. The first one is traceability. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I've been working on these traceability issues for many, many years. And when I first started, people said it couldn't be done. But then as we realized with time, not only can it be done, and in slightly different ways within every industry, but if we want to assure this integrity of the food system, it has to be done. That what I fondly call the salsa scare of last year is the perfect example of why. We found people being sickened by salsa, and we couldn't figure out why. This destroyed pretty much the entire profit of the tomato crop for that whole year because everybody thought it was tomatoes that had the salmonella. As it turned out, after months and months and months of increased sickness, of increased scrutiny, we found out that no, it wasn't the tomatoes at all. It was jalapenos, and they were from Texas. And what I've found out is that we can go to this particular sector of the field and find those jalapenos, and we can do it quickly. So traceability is going to be essential, and I look forward to working with my friends on the other side of the aisle to make sure it's not onerous. But I will say this, it is not just in the interest of consumers, it's in the interest of businesses who want to protect their profits to have traceability. Mandatory recall is the second provision of this bill that I've been working on for many years, and I'm so grateful has been included. And I want to say finally, Mr. Chairman, all of this policy that we talk about, it's all well and good, but I can't help but think about young Jacob Hurley, who you might have seen. He was in our last O&I committee hearing. Jacob is from Portland, Oregon, and he got sick from eating peanut butter crackers, his favorite food. When his parents took him to the doctor, they said they finally got him stabilized and he wouldn't eat. So they told the parents, have Jacob just eat what he loves, the peanut butter crackers, the very food that had made him sick in the first place. And the only way we found out about this was because the alert commissioner of consumer protection in Oregon showed up personally at his door and confiscated the peanut butter crackers. We need to fix this. We need to fix it now, and I'm so grateful that we are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. DeGette. Next is the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer.
Ma'am, welcome to the committee. Is it Hamburg or Hamburg? Hamburg. Welcome. And my first reaction to the discussion draft is going to lead to some questions that I'll have for you today. It appears that Congress, a lot of times we like to pound our chest and then show to the American people that we're doing something well, but we really end up creating legislation within our own areas of jurisdiction, and we create problems. We create things that are multiplicious and redundancies, and if we really wanted to couple substance with the words that I've heard here from some of my colleagues today, we would be working with other committees of jurisdiction. We would have a very comprehensive bill. And so I'm going to be asking you questions, ma'am, about clear lines of delineations and responsibilities between USDA and FDA. And who should really have what responsibility? Or should we as a nation put all food under one agency and work cooperatively with the Ag Committee to do something like that? What we have is a discussion draft that has been cleverly drafted only within the jurisdiction of our own committee. And so what we end up doing is, are we exasperating a problem? And so I'm interested in your leadership. You're representing an administration. And so I'm interested in your best counsel to us and your willingness to work with leaders of other agencies to truly protect the American people. And the other point I make is that Congress, as of late, has been beating up on FDA. I would say the FDA, the individuals that I've met and the ones that you have the privilege to lead, are some pretty fine and capable and dedicated individuals. In the last, 16 years, 17 years that I have been here, whether it's been Republicans in control or Democrats, we continue to pass legislation that leaves more and more responsibilities upon your core missions. And so here, as you're challenged to maintain the gold standards, not only with regard to pharmaceuticals, but also in food, you know, we're about to send you legislation for a new mission on tobacco that's counter to your even cultural mission. Yet we're going to continue to make you the whipping post. And so I'm really concerned about the more responsibilities we give you, how much does that dilute your responsibilities? And so those are some of the questions that I'm going to be posing to you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
I thank the chair, and I appreciate the leadership you're showing on this issue. This is a matter of particular interest to me since, as Mr. Deal has already pointed out, two of the most egregious recent cases of tainted food in the food supply originate in my state of Georgia, and I think this bill represents a major step forward in trying to prevent this from happening again. One of the things that's a particular bone of contention with me is that in the last outbreak, we got evidence in this committee that the manufacturer had test results which were showing positive presence of salmonella. The food he was sending out into the marketplace was tainted, and yet they didn't report that to the FDA. It seems to me that what we need to have, in addition to the good measures that have been incorporated in this bill, is an effective testing regime that has integrity in terms of sampling and integrity in terms of testing. And I think we've got to make it easy for folks to be able to do this, to comply with this, and mandatory for them to report the results of any testing. That's why I think we can pick the bad actors out really early on and perhaps even do a better job of arresting trends at a very early stage, detecting problems before they become serious. Above all, we want to make sure that we don't bring about the Sergeant Schultz syndrome. You know, he was the comic character in Hogan's Heroes who made a big, loud comic demonstration every now and then of not knowing what was inconvenient for him to know. And so we want to make sure that folks don't have the option of opting out or have a disincentive to know what they need to know when they need to know it, and that we know what they know when they need to know it. So that's the balance I think we need to strike here. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this as we try and incorporate provisions like that in this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank the chairman, Dr. Hamburg, Dr. Sharfstein. Good to see you again. Spent some time yesterday out at the FDA's facility, and I will echo the comments of Mr. Boyer. You have a wonderful staff that you lead out there. They're obviously very, very dedicated individuals, sometimes working under the adverse conditions that we supply, but certainly I know you're very proud of the organization of which you lead, and I believe that pride is justified. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stipulate to all of the difficulties that the Food and Drug Administration is encountering that have already been well documented, and I would ask unanimous consent to insert my entire statement into the record. Let me just concentrate on the aspect that we are now finally, after I don't know how many hearings on this, getting down to somewhat of the business of acting for the FDA and talking about legislation that would give the Food and Drug Administration some tools, but we're also giving them a time frame which may prove to be a very difficult time frame for implementation, and we're also putting some additional burden on businesses at a time that our economy's in some difficulty. The legislation proposed will mandate the largest change in food safety in at least 2 decades, and it will give the entire food industry a compressed time to do so. In a few short months, we'll have to turn the current system of paper-based records into an electronic form. The businesses will have to find the money to register as a food facility and additional user fees if we deem them appropriate in the future, and they'll have to be able to fully trace the food to its place of origin. All of those may be laudable goals, but I'm not certain that what we're proposing as a time frame is adequate. And then the Food and Drug Administration itself, in that shortened, compressed time frame, will have to hire enough inspectors to meet the new inspection standards, create unique identifier numbers for every food facility, be they domestic or foreign, set up a new administrative law position for the new criminal and civil penalties, and make certain that each center has a food safety plan. All of this instantly demanded in one piece of legislation. I would just point out, when we did the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act last year, H.R. 4040, we acted in good faith and we acted with some dispatch, but we created some situations that are absolutely untenable. We've had to go back and try to amend some of those. We've driven some small businesses to the point of bankruptcy. We've created a situation where our resale shops, because they cannot measure the lead standard that we required, are in a position that they don't know whether they can sell the goods that they've been donated or not. So I urge us to take every due caution. The law of unintended consequences has a very short turnaround time in our current globalized world, and we need to be cognizant of that. And then finally, let me just, a word about bipartisanship. A bill is bipartisan if it is bipartisan at the beginning. And Chairman Dingell, I appreciate the courtesy that you showed me in the last Congress in involving me at least in some of the preliminary discussions of the draft that you were considering. But really, when the draft comes to the committee for consideration, it really ought to have had input from both sides. And the fact that there are 5 or 6 Democrats on the bill and no Republican. Was there no Republican on this side of the dais with which you could sit down and talk and perhaps get to a point where there could be some general agreement? We've done this before on other pieces of legislation. We did it on the Food and Drug Reauthorization Act in June of 2007, and I frankly do not understand why it is not worth the effort to make these pieces of legislation. We're not talking about points for the next election. We're talking about the regime that will be in place that will ensure the safety of the food for my grandson and Marcia's grandchildren. This is the legacy that we're going to be leaving, and it is too important to be left to partisan politics. And I thank you for the additional time, Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to welcome Peggy Hamburg, an old friend, a brilliant physician, and a superbly qualified person to this committee and to her new role as FDA Commissioner. I think you bring a lot to this job and will help this committee, which has worked on this issue for the issue of food safety for years and years and years, come to a thoughtful, careful, helpful decision on the shape of this legislation. So welcome. Mr. Chairman, I'm very comfortable with the discussion draft, and I do know that it reflects many, many years of input from members. I thought that John Dingell's comment that it's almost old enough to vote was particularly apt. That applies to me too. And I think that coming from a state like California, which is the largest agricultural producer in the country, we ignore food safety at our peril. The Vice Chairman, Diana DeGette, was chronicling some of the recent outbreaks and how important it is to have traceability and mandatory recall. I agree. And we could have saved a lot of pain, a lot of cost, and a lot of health problems had we had those measures in place. So I just want to conclude by saying that we have a able and willing partner facing us this morning. I think we have an able and willing committee on a bipartisan basis to engage with her, and I'm very eager to see us make progress and to enact legislation close to the committee draft as soon as possible. It's in our national interest, and surely, as we talk about grandchildren, it's in our grandchildren's interest. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome Dr. Tim Jones, who is going to be on our second panel. He's hiding over here in the back. He must be one of these Baptists from Tennessee. He's going to sit in the back row until time for him to come forward. But Dr. Jones is an epidemiologist with the Department of Health in our great state. It does a wonderful job for our state, and I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to be able to hear from him today on the second panel. So, Dr. Jones, thank you for taking the time to come. While the draft legislation before us today attempts to improve the safety and the efficacy of the nation's food supply, it appears that there is still a lot of room for improvement. And I'm appreciative that we are having the hearing, and I am hopeful that we're going to be able to work in a bipartisan way on this issue. I appreciate the majority's attempt to improve the country's food safety system, but I think that we all know, especially those of us who are mothers, we know that you can't inspect your way to food safety. We know that this legislation is going to have to do more than be reactive. This legislation broadly increases the FDA authority to make it one of the largest federal agencies in the existence. My concern is the growth of bureaucracy and what is going to happen as that bureaucracy grows. What I do think is necessary, and I think it is necessary, that our system be risk-based, that it be preventative, and take that approach, and that it effectively target bad actors. It is imperative that resources are focused on issues of high risk and interventions that are most effective. However, this bill places undue burden on small businesses, and they would be harmed by burdensome and expensive provisions that are found in this current draft of this legislation. The FDA has provided no evidence that it has improved its internal processes in order to improve the review of the nation's food supply. This is something we have talked about endlessly in this committee and in hearings. So we're looking forward to having some questions on this. There seems to be, and you haven't proven otherwise, that there are established protocols and lines of communication between different jurisdictions. You have not shown that there are best practices. Indeed, about 13 months ago, I asked for a list of best practices on intra-agency communication and how you are sharing this information, how you are working with your affiliates so that everyone can more easily pinpoint and get to the bottom of problems and bad actors and issues that are coming forward. And yesterday, the FDA announced that they are studying ways to make the agency more transparent. This should have been done before we pass a bill that would give the agency millions of dollars in user fees. And I'm going to yield my time back and submit my full statement for the record and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Dr. Hamburg. I know New York has suffered a great loss, but the nation needs you more. I also think it's very fitting that as we've come back to Congress and begin to put the nuts and bolts on our health care reform legislation, that the first hearing that this committee is having is with FDA, because I believe we'll begin that reform with an overhaul and a better resourcing of the Food and Drug Administration. From the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009 that we're looking at in draft today, and the Family Smoking Prevention and Control Act of 2009, we're looking at a new FDA. And you have the challenge as well as the opportunity to remake this important institution in ways that it better serves the health of the American public, while also fostering, guiding, and supporting the bringing of new and better treatments to us as well. I have confidence in a better resourced FDA with more authority, and one that's not overly prescriptive. I don't want to be overly prescriptive on what we tell the agency to do, but I hope that we'll be able to allow the agency to do its job based on clear authority, adequate resources, and sound science. In the case of food safety, in my first few months on this committee, I've really been alarmed to find out what has happened that has put the public's health in jeopardy, from salmonella to some questions about even the IRB process and several other areas. So we're here to help you create a better, stronger FDA, and this hearing is part of that process. And I thank you and all of the panelists for sharing their experience and expertise with us this morning.
Thank you. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Hamburg. Pennsylvania's #1 industry is agriculture, and with that comes a lot of food processing. We're honored to have national companies located in Pennsylvania like Hershey's. We have companies like Welch's, grows a lot of grapes there. And more locally in the Pittsburgh area, regional distributors of groceries like Giant Eagle, national distributors of olive products like DeLallo's, and of course big names like Del Monte and the corporate headquarters of Heinz, and small companies like Sarah's Chocolates that sells around the country. All of them have talked with us about concerns for this bill and certainly are very supportive of making sure we have a strong FDA, and we want to make sure that happens. A few questions are raised, and I hope I'll be able to remain for part of this hearing, although I have to run to the floor, and I apologize for that. I missed some of this, but a number of issues. Making sure that there is no unintended consequences of the bill that leads to increased prices for consumers. Let's work on that, on the registration fee, particularly as it may affect some smaller businesses trying to work. Also, with regard to the traceability, need to be clear what exactly the obligations are for both the processed and fresh food industry. Are we talking about traceability of final product or traceability of every ingredient that went into the product? For example, if a local restaurant chain makes cookies or someone else makes cookies, trying to track every single ingredient that comes up with a specific food color dye may be a problem for them, and we'd like to make sure we make that work for the safety of consumers, but not in a way that impairs companies from doing their work. And also, unintended consequences of giving the FDA's copies of all test results could be less testing. As companies go through lots and lots of tests for products that never make it to market, would it be to test the hundreds of samples each day have to be available, or change to the testing of products that are in the marketplace? With regard to the country of origin labeling and disclosure, to list every ingredient on a website could increase the cost and resources and not necessarily bring added value. Could there be some general labels, such as some statement that this product may contain ingredients from one or more of the following countries? Also, how about raising the importance of making sure that all enforcement standards and auditors, all enforcement officers and auditors are well trained and calibrated to work to define audit standard? There's also concern of what happens with a family farm that may sell to local grocery stores. To what level would they have to comply? And would it be that the fees for them would be so high that they simply could not sell any products outside of their own farm store? And does that impair some small distributors? How do we help them? Another issue for grocery stores, what if they make packaged food at their stores, such as some value-added ground beef products made in their meat departments? What happens if they mix in other foods at their store? How does the bill affect them in other ways? So certainly in Pennsylvania, we want strong food safety bills. We want ones that protect consumers. We want small businesses to be encouraged and large businesses to be supported, but also encourage new startups. But more than anything else this week, we want the Penguins to win the Stanley Cup. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding the hearing today on the discussion draft of the food safety legislation. Over the past year or so, there have been several high-profile food contamination incidents in the United States involving spinach, cantaloupes, peanut butter, and tomatoes. This committee has diligently investigated all these incidents. Though these hearings on the FDA have clearly shown us that the FDA simply does not have the resources, funding, or manpower, technology it needs to protect the American food supply and fulfill its mission. Chairman Dingell, Chairman Pallone, and Chairman Stupak have worked tirelessly in this proposed legislation, and I'd like to applaud them for their dedication on this issue. I'm hopeful for this hearing, and the discussion draft will bring us one step closer to passing food safety legislation out of the House. I have a brief chance to review the legislation. I'd like to briefly discuss a couple of issues that concern me. The discussion draft allows for food imported to be inspected by third-party accredited labs to conduct sample analysis. I support the provision, but I'd like to see an investment in construction FDA labs. The Port of Houston is the largest port in the U.S. in terms of foreign tonnage, and a large portion of that is related to our energy industry, but the port imported 606,000 tons of imported food in 2007. The Port of Houston does not have an FDA lab, and surprisingly, no FDA lab in Texas, even though we share the longest border with Mexico. I've yet to understand why Texas, with its level of trade and southern border with Mexico, does not have an FDA lab. In fact, there are over 300 ports of entry in the United States, and only 13 ports actually have FDA labs. I hope my colleague from Arkansas will forgive me, but the closest FDA lab in Houston, the entire state of Texas, located in Arkansas. Houston isn't the only import area in Texas. Cities like Laredo, Texas, it's the largest or one of the largest land locked ports of entry in the world, imports from Mexico, literally trailers, thousands of trailers on a weekly basis. It seems unwise and frankly unsafe to have the FDA lab for the entire state of Texas located hundreds of miles away in another state. The location of FDA labs throughout the U.S. needs to be evaluated, and reports should be submitted to Congress on whether the FDA labs are located where they are most needed. The discussion draft allows FDA to assess current FDA lab locations and to relocate labs as necessary. I'd like to hear from the FDA on whether they have any plans to evaluate current FDA lab locations. Congress also needs allocated funds to the building of more FDA labs. I was pleased to see the President's budget. The allocation of funds has established 3 high-volume FDA labs. If we want FDA truly to ensure the safety of our food supply, we need to build more FDA labs in areas where food imports are arriving, such as Houston, so the FDA can quickly and accurately test our food imports and ensure food safety. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to hearing our witnesses, and thank you again thank our new FDA director for appearing before the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Our ranking member, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. We support there being a legislative hearing and hearing on food safety. We think it's time to address this problem in a bipartisan fashion, if at all possible. We do think it's important that we try to get it right, if at all possible. We understand that it's your wish and the full committee chairman's wish and former Chairman Dingell's wish to move with legislation sometime this month. Republicans are ready to help if we can agree on a bill that provides the FDA with the tools that it needs to ensure the safety of our food supply, but we will not support new blanket authorities that are designed merely to empower the bureaucracy. Nearly everybody says that, quote, we cannot inspect our way to food safety, end quote. We need systems that reliably prevent sickness by applying resources in those places that are most susceptible to contamination. The draft before us proposes several areas that strengthen prevention of food illness outbreaks, such as requiring all manufacturers to have food safety plans and also the creation of appropriate produce standards. These ideas make sense and have near universal support. We are concerned, however, that parts of the draft add more weight than quality to the regulations and, in our opinion, provide too much discretion to the FDA without any corresponding food safety benefit. For example, country of origin labeling is not about food safety. As a practical matter, it will simply increase the cost of groceries at the store. We know this because expert after expert has testified at the committee that this provision has absolutely no effect on safety. There are several other specific concerns with the draft, including the level and the scope of the registration fees. I will say that the registration fees are less in this draft than they have been in some previous drafts, so that I can at least say that we're moving in the right direction. Having said that, it does appear that the majority simply wants $300 to $400 million in additional funds for the FDA, and we can't see that there's any clear purpose for that amount of funding. Having said that, we look forward to the hearings, and if we can work on some of these problems, we're prepared to be positively engaged in the markup that comes after the hearings. With that, Mr. Chairman, we yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing on this extraordinarily important issue. I want to extend my appreciation to the sponsor of this bill and all of those who for so long have been fighting the fight to fix our food safety system and make sure that the food that is on the table to feed our families is safe for their consumption, and that which goes with them to school, they can fear not that it will be safe for their children to eat. Chairman Emeritus Dingell, I thank you very much for your long effort in improving our food safety network, along with Representative Dingell, Representative Stupak, and others throughout on both sides of the aisle, and look forward to working with you. As you may know, the very first bill that I introduced in the House, I believe, was a bill to call for mandatory recall authority for the FDA. And there's a reason for that. I mean, we have seen these problems arise again and again and again within our food safety network, and the American people, I think, would have been shocked, as I was, to learn that our government did not have the authority to issue a mandatory recall when it became apparent that it was necessary. Ohio has suffered the effects of problems with our food safety system. Most recently, the salmonella outbreak has claimed lives and harmed many throughout the Buckeye State, and it's critical that we are moving forward with a comprehensive bill to finally address and ensure the safety of America's tables and our system. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing, and congratulations, Commissioner, for your confirmation. I look forward to working with you. Some difficult issues ahead. I'm glad this committee is focused on food safety. I think we can all agree that the FDA needs more resources to protect our food supply and strengthen public health. I am concerned, however, that this might be a ready, shoot, aim event. We just passed a fairly onerous bill and added a lot of authority to the FDA that had a huge loophole in it that allowed tobacco regulation to be borrowed from the general fund of the FDA. So you have this hole of millions and millions of dollars, of which you're going to have to try to apply to thousands and thousands of new regulators. At the same time, we're trying to improve food safety, and I can't think of anything more important than our food supply. I mean, my hat's off to you, Commissioner, on the challenge of which you've just accepted. As we all know, the FDA is currently unable to inspect a majority of the nation's food facilities. Worse, many high-risk facilities have gone without inspection and oversight at all. Over the last 2 years, we've seen the impact of this failure, numerous Salmonella and E. coli outbreaks which have sickened thousands and even led to death. I hope that this bill can eventually be a bipartisan bill. However, many of the concerns that we have expressed have not been addressed, and we have not had the opportunity to sit down and have a discussion before this bill has come before the committee, and I think that's horribly unfortunate when you're talking about food safety and food safety issues. The user fees in this draft are concerning to me. As written, the bill would require $1,000 in a registration fee per food facility, but these funds totaling about $375 million, which will be passed along to consumers, which are regular families trying to pay their bills already, there's nothing in there that dedicates this to new inspections. So we've come up with a new tax regimen that doesn't benefit the FDA in getting it to the place where you need it most, which is inspectors for food facilities and food supply. Makes no sense to me, and that's something we absolutely have to change in this bill, or, Madam Commissioner, you're going to be looking at a very tough hole to fill again. There's nothing in here that tells the appropriators where to put that money so that you can best use it to accomplish the mission of which this bill will tell you it has to do without telling you where the money's coming from. That's almost dangerous when you think about this plus the FDA Tobacco Regulation Authority that allows them to take your money for food supply inspections and drug approval and use it for hiring new regulators for tobacco. That's a real problem that we need to fix, not only in this bill, at least I hope we can. If food producers are required to pay this new tax, they should absolutely have the certainty that the funds are going to be used for food safety inspections. I think that's common sense. I think we could all agree on it. I would hope to work with the majority to get that taken care of. In addition, the draft's inspection schedule seems almost impossible to achieve. Today, I hope, Commissioner, that you can shed some light on what a practical, risk-based inspection schedule should look like, and I hope you can cover that today in your statement and through questions. I also have several other concerns. The new broad recall authorities, I think recall authority is important, but how it's done is incredibly important. An expansive new civil penalty regime, new labeling requirements that don't seem to have anything to do with food safety. Again, I think all of these issues we can address if we work together in a bipartisan manner, and I think come around something that we all believe needs to happen, and that's more resources for food inspection and food safety regimes that the FDA has a primary responsibility for. I look forward to working with you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this, I think, all-important hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the fact that you're holding today's hearing, and also want to join my colleagues in commending you and Chairman Stupak and Chairman Emeritus Dingell and Chairman Waxman for putting this very important discussion draft before us that addresses very serious challenges that we face with respect to food safety. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to submit for the record written testimony from the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection in the state of Wisconsin.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Food safety is an issue of great concern to me and my constituents. Approximately 1 in 4 people in this country are affected or sickened by foodborne disease each year. As Americans, we rely on government to keep us safe, and as government, we have fallen down on the job. As we consider this draft legislation, I know that our goal is to empower the FDA to prevent food contamination incidents before they occur. I hope that we do so with appropriate and sufficient resources, but also with precise coordination between other federal agencies, the states, and the private sector. Currently, with its limited resources, the FDA focuses its inspections on large manufacturers engaged in interstate commerce, and it leaves much of the frontline work to the states. This bill creates a risk-based inspection system that significantly increases the frequency of inspections. I want to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts and that we can empower states to perform their work on the ground with logistical and financial support. I urge the FDA to use this legislation to create a stronger, more integrated food safety system that leverages state and local resources. As another result of limited resources, FDA relies on many private sector firms to conduct food safety testing on a contractual basis. I'm pleased that the discussion draft includes a provision that would allow a laboratory accreditation process facilitating the FDA's use of third-party laboratories to perform testing. And I want to make sure that the conflict of interest language in the bill does not prevent some of the most experienced laboratories from maintaining their strong partnership with the FDA moving forward. I look forward to hearing your testimony, Dr. Hamburg, and that of the other witnesses today. And I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
Thank you. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, public health officials estimate that 76 million people become sick, 325,000 are actually hospitalized, and 5,000 die each year from foodborne illnesses caused by contamination. Incidents like those in my own home state of Georgia, where the actions of a few bad actors and a breakdown in effective government oversight sickened more than 677 people in 45 states and caused at least 9 deaths, underscores the need for action. I agree with my colleagues that more needs to be done to ensure that the food products American consumers buy are safe. Additionally, I support the efforts of this committee as it reviews ways to streamline and improve the food inspection system in this country. Mr. Chairman, I hope that these hearings will continue to allow us the opportunity to reflect on the breakdowns in our current system, as well as the appropriate solutions to safeguard the health and welfare of all Americans. Madam Commissioner, I commend you for your recent appointment. Look forward to hearing from you and from the next panel of witnesses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Hamburg. I don't think anyone sitting over here has anything but good wishes for you and the enormous challenges you face, and we wish you well and look forward to many fruitful and productive conversations with you. As Vice Chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, I've been very involved in the hearings that we've had up to this point on this important subject, and I'm glad to see us finally getting to the point of considering legislation that's so critical to the health and safety of Americans. Throughout this process, we've seen examples of both good and bad actors in the food industry. Some companies like Nestle USA set the standard with proactive food safety audits and showed us what can happen when companies do the right thing in reaching out and doing their own investigations. On the other hand, we heard extensively about Peanut Corporation of America and its unsanitary and unsafe conditions and about its action to misrepresent the results of audits that were done which put people at risk and cost people their lives. That's why we're here today to talk about what we can do to improve the current state of the situation. This Food Safety Enhancement Act will solve many of the FDA's current limitations, and I'm glad that it requires increased inspections of food facilities, tiered inspection systems that distinguish between high-risk facilities, low-risk facilities, and warehouses, And I also support the provisions to ensure the safety of imported foods, which is something I fought for since introduction of the Fresh Produce Safety Act last Congress. Also, very importantly, I'm very proud that this bill has strong whistleblower protections, and I believe that it will help keep America's food supply safe. Many might consider some of the provisions in this bill burdensome. However, it's important to look at the opportunity cost of failing to take action to improve food safety. In our March 19th oversight hearing, I asked David Mackey, who's the CEO of Kellogg, how much the PCA salmonella outbreak had cost his company. And he replied between $65 and $70 million. The legislation before us today might have prevented that outbreak and saved those costs. Most important, however, is what we owe to the families of this country who have been injured or killed by unsafe foods and the desire to take real action to keep our food supply safe. In 2006, a graduate of Dubuque-Wahlert High School in my district, a marathon runner named Jill Cole, contracted E. coli from a spinach salad that she ate. After 17 days in the hospital, she was released with just 8% of her kidney function, and she now has to see a doctor twice a year to monitor her kidneys. Jill and all other Americans should be able to have faith that their food is safe, and we're here today to try to restore that faith. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Hamburg. We're so excited to see you in this position, and we look forward to your testimony on the proposed legislation. The comment's been made a couple of times that we can't inspect our way to food safety, and that may be true, but we can non-inspect our way to food danger, which I think has been, unfortunately, the hallmark of what's happened in recent past. And so this bill that's proposed is going to put so much more emphasis on monitoring and inspection on the front end, which is going to make a tremendous difference. When you look at the provisions that are contained in this proposed legislation, so many of them go under the heading of no-brainers. In other words, these are things that the average citizen would imagine are already in place, and I think would be surprised to learn are not in place. And so there's so much about this bill that represents sort of the pent-up needs and concerns of the American public that we need to address. On the economics, and there's been a fair amount of discussion about that already just in the opening statements, the better we do on the front end, of course, with monitoring and inspection, the less costs we're going to have on the back end, both in terms of FDA needing to scramble to deal with outbreaks of foodborne illness, but also the saved cost of businesses of not having to deal with the effects of that. And I think that those saved costs will far outweigh the investment that we put in on the front end, and certainly justify many of the measures that are contained in this bill. So we look forward to your testimony. Welcome and good luck to you. Yield back my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to Dr. Hamburg's testimony and members of the other panels. I think what we're talking about here today is setting very high but very reasonable expectations for what we can do out of the FDA. And I think that if that's our goal, we can get a product that both parties can be proud of. As the former chair of Connecticut's Public Health Committee, I think I speak for a lot of state policymakers in our feeling of helplessness over the past 5 to 10 years especially. And I think you're going to find, as this committee will find, a lot of allies in state public health networks. They're going to be very supportive of this transformation that you're undergoing to try to assist in their efforts, which have been very difficult over the past several years. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I'm very appreciative to you and to Mr. Dingell and others for including in this bill several aspects of the work that my colleague in Connecticut, Chairwoman of the Agriculture Agricultural Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro. She's been working as a tireless advocate on this issue, and parts of this bill relative to the inspection frequency for the riskiest foods out there, enforceable performance standards for foodborne pathogens, are parts of her efforts incorporated into the underlying bill, and I appreciate you paying attention to her work here as well. Look forward to your testimony. Thank you for being here. Yield back.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and kudos as well to Rosa DeLauro and Bart Stupak and John Dingell, our colleagues here that have worked for many years to improve food safety in America. And welcome to Dr. Hamburg. Based upon your background, obviously, you enjoy a challenge, and food safety is an important challenge for our country. Of all the issues we deal with in this subcommittee, food is the most ubiquitous. It is relevant to all Americans. I wanted to remind my colleagues that the Government Accountability Office, remember, keeps that very short list of major government problems that require broad transformation before they can ever hope to be effective. The list, called the High Risk Series, includes notorious government failures such as the financial regulatory system, which failed to prevent the largest financial collapse in generations. It includes the implementation of the Homeland Security Department, which has been plagued from the beginning by cost overruns. And no surprise, it also includes federal oversight of food safety. And here's an example from last year that really hurt in my home state of Florida. Tomatoes last year from Florida were blamed for a nationwide salmonella outbreak that was eventually traced to jalapeno and serrano peppers from Mexico. In the meantime, FDA intimated at the time not to consume Florida tomatoes, and that cost our state and agricultural producers and hardworking folks over $100 million. All of the time and effort spent hinting and suggesting that Florida tomatoes were the problem only served to delay the solution to the real problem and allow more Americans to get sick. Our committee understands the problem. This committee has held several hearings, and we understand that we must act expeditiously. Part of the problem lies in the lack of federal authority to effectively respond to a crisis. When FDA does not have incontrovertible proof of a specific food contamination, it cannot today issue a mandatory recall. Instead, it must rely on corporations to voluntarily choose to pull inventory from the shelves. The FDA does not even have the ability to assess civil penalties. This legislation before us gives the FDA that long overdue enforcement authority. The problems facing food safety and oversight are legion, and they are difficult, but they're not insurmountable, and I'm confident that we will move the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009 quickly and provide American consumers with a safe, transparent, and reliable food supply. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing on the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. And I want to extend the warmest welcome and congratulations to Dr. Hamburg. She is a woman of exceptional talent, high intellect, a person with great character, and someone that has given much to our country already and comes from one of the most outstanding families, I think, in our country. I am so, you can tell how elated I am that the President chose so wisely in appointing you as FDA Commissioner, and we all look forward to working with you. To the extent that you succeed, the country is going to succeed. I also think that, that your tenure can be and will be the mark where the FDA returns to being the gold standard in terms of a public agency. The American people believe in the FDA. They want the FDA to succeed because what you do, they can't do for themselves. And the decisions that are taken can be the difference between life and death. That's how profound the decisions are. So I can't tell you how thrilled I am that you are the one. I'm pleased that the legislation that we're considering is going to improve the traceability of food, because when tainted food is discovered, it's critical that we know where it has come from, where it's gone, and what stores it's sold in. If sales are limited to a certain area, targeted recall could take place, which would be more effective for consumers and businesses. And I'm also pleased to see that the mandatory country of origin labeling for food is included in the bill. I think in today's environment, this is really essential information for consumers to know where their food comes from. This is a long and complex bill, and I too, along with my colleague, Mr. Murphy from Connecticut, really want to salute those that have worked on this issue. Rosa DeLauro has just been tireless, and you know that she brings passion and intellect to what she does. And so some of the ideas from her legislation are embedded in this. I look forward to our conversation. I hope that what we are asking the FDA to do, that you are really up to it. I think that we've lived on fees for a long time. And I still have questions and would like to know directly from you whether you really think you're going to have the resources that are necessary to do this. Because if you don't, then the print of the legislation or law will be wonderful to read, like some constitutions around the world that are absolutely magnificent, but they're not worth the paper that they're written on. We have fallen off the edge of a cliff in terms of what's coming into the country and what's happened to the American people. We have to get this right this time. And some think that there should be a standalone food inspection agency. Can the FDA actually do all of this? Do you have the resources for it? I mean, if there's pizza that has pepperoni on it versus pizza that doesn't have any meat on it, should there be a split jurisdiction between agriculture and the FDA in terms of inspection? I think the more splits there are, the more that there's more of an opportunity for things to fall through the cracks. I may be entirely wrong, but I still have some questions. I don't think this is a perfect piece of legislation, but I'm sure glad that we're considering the issue. I wish you nothing but the best. I have great, great confidence and respect for you, and I'm very proud that the President chose to pick the best in the country for this job. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations, Dr. Hamburg. I come to this issue with a lot of history and also this particular issue with a lot of emotion. My good friend Nancy Donnelly, whose only child, Alex, was lost because of eating a hamburger with E. coli, and then dedicated her life to creating an organization, Safe Tables Our Priority, has worked tirelessly for food safety. And every time, year after year, we have people coming before us telling these devastating stories, and every time we say we're going to do something so that never happens again, and yet it does. In February, we heard testimony from Peter Hurley, whose young son was made ill by eating Austin peanut butter crackers. They were found in millions of homes, and we were all shocked by documents presented at that hearing that showed that the Peanut Corporation of America knew that their products were tainted and yet released them into the food supply anyway. So the discussion draft that's before us includes provisions that will seriously fill many of the gaps in our current food system. I wanted to just mention a couple of things that I think ought to be considered for review. There's just a brief mention in the bill dealing with the issue of antibiotic-resistant pathogens and the extent to which antibiotics that are used in livestock contributes to this resistance. We don't necessarily always think about this as food safety, but I think it's a truly important issue. We've looked H1N1. I know it was a virus, but nonetheless, everybody's waiting for that kind of plague that we don't have the cure for, partly because of antibiotic resistance. Second, I believe the companies who have positive test results for possibly dangerous contaminants should be required to report those results to the FDA. We heard how PCA, nobody knew about it, and I think there are many other examples. It's a question on how the FDA effectively can ensure the safety of our food if we don't even know where there might be a problem. And finally, I believe the collecting and disseminating of information about food safety and foodborne illness to consumers is a critical component of any food safety plan. I'm encouraged by the provisions of the bill, but I think there may be more that we can do to ensure that Americans are adequately informed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I believe that completes our members' opening statements.